The doors of the church slammed open before the priest could finish his sentence, and every head in the room turned at once. Elena Marlowe stood frozen at the altar, her hand still resting inside Daniel Whitfield's palm, the white lace of her sleeve trembling against his sleeve. She had been seconds away from becoming his wife. Now the cold air from the open doors rushed down the aisle and swept over the guests, carrying with it the sound of heavy footsteps on marble. A man walked in alone. He wore a dark gray suit, perfectly tailored, and his face held no expression at all. Elena did not know him, but she knew who he was. Everyone in the room seemed to know who he was. His name moved through the crowd in whispers before he had even reached the third row of seats. Vittorio Marchetti. Elena's mother gripped the edge of her seat. Daniel's face went pale, though he tried to hide it behind a tight, forced smile. The priest looked between the bride and the stranger, unsure whether to continue or stop. Vittorio did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He walked straight down the aisle, past rows of stunned guests in silk dresses and pressed suits, until he stood only a few feet from the altar. His eyes moved to Elena first, then to Daniel, and something in his gaze made Daniel take a small step backward. "Forgive the interruption," Vittorio said, his voice calm and low, "but this wedding cannot continue, not until the bride hears something she deserves to know." The priest opened his mouth to object, but one look from Vittorio silenced him. Elena felt her pulse hammering in her throat. She had spent months planning this day. She had chosen the flowers herself, white roses mixed with soft blue hydrangeas. She had memorized her vows. And now a stranger in an expensive suit was standing between her and the altar, and no one in the room dared to stop him. "Who are you?" Elena asked, surprised at how steady her own voice sounded. "Someone who knew your father," Vittorio said, "and someone who cannot let you make the biggest mistake of your life without a warning." Daniel finally found his voice. "This is absurd. Whoever you are, you need to leave. This is my wedding." Vittorio did not even look at him. His eyes stayed on Elena. He stepped closer, close enough that only she could hear him clearly over the murmurs spreading through the pews. He leaned in, and for one long moment, time seemed to stop. Then he whispered 3 words. "He is lying." Elena blinked. She had expected something dramatic, a name, an accusation, anything with more shape to it. Instead, those 3 simple words landed like stones, dropped into still water, and the ripples spread through her chest until she could barely breathe. "What did you say?" she whispered back. Vittorio straightened and looked at Daniel, who had gone rigid, his jaw locked tight. "Ask him what happens to your father's company the moment you sign your name today. Ask him where the money goes. Ask him why he chose you, out of everyone, to marry." Gasps rippled through the guests. Elena's mother rose halfway from her seat, one hand pressed to her mouth. Daniel's family exchanged glances that were far too knowing, far too careful, as if they had rehearsed looking calm for exactly this moment. "Elena, don't listen to him," Daniel said quickly. "He's a criminal. Everyone knows the name Marchetti. He's trying to ruin us." "Then answer the question," Vittorio said simply. "If there is nothing to hide, answer it in front of everyone." The silence that followed was worse than any shouting could have been. Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. His eyes darted toward his best man, toward his mother in the front row, toward the exit at the back of the church, as if he were calculating how far he could run. Elena felt the world tilting beneath her white satin shoes. She turned to look at her mother, hoping to find reassurance, but her mother's face had gone the color of chalk, and that told Elena everything she needed to know. Her mother had known something. Maybe not everything, but something. "Mom?" Elena said, her voice cracking. Her mother said nothing. She simply looked down at her lap, unable to meet her daughter's eyes. Elena turned back to Daniel. 2 years of dating, 6 months of engagement, 100 small promises whispered in the dark. She had believed every one of them. Now, standing at the altar in front of 200 guests, she realized she did not know the man beside her at all. "Tell me he's wrong," Elena said to Daniel. "Just tell me, and I'll believe you." Daniel's silence stretched on, and in that silence, Elena found her answer. She slipped her hand out of his. The church erupted into noise. Guests stood, phones came out. Someone near the back began recording. Daniel reached for her arm, but she pulled away, stepping back until she bumped into the altar rail. Vittorio moved slightly, not touching her, but positioning his body so that Daniel could not easily reach her again. "Elena, please," Daniel said, his composure cracking for the first time. "It's not what it sounds like. Let me explain, not here, not like this." "Then explain it now," Elena said. Her voice shook, but she did not look away from him. "You have everyone's attention. Explain." Daniel glanced at Vittorio, then at the crowd, then back at Elena, and something in his expression shifted from panic to calculation. He was deciding what version of the truth he could still get away with telling. "Your father owed money," Daniel finally said, quietly, as if lowering his voice could make the words less damaging. "A lot of money. To people who do not forgive debts easily. Marrying you was supposed to settle it. My family would absorb the debt, and in exchange, we would take control of Marlowe Textiles once we were married. It was a business arrangement. That's all it ever was." Elena felt her knees weaken. "A business arrangement," she repeated. "You proposed to me, you told me you loved me." "I do love you," Daniel said, though even he seemed to hear how hollow the words sounded now. "You were marrying me to steal my father's company," Elena said. "It's not stealing if it settles a debt," Daniel said, and that single sentence, spoken so plainly, so without shame, told Elena more about him than 2 years of dating ever had. Vittorio spoke again, his tone unreadable. "Tell her the rest, Daniel. Tell her what happens to the company once the papers are signed. Tell her what happens to her." Daniel's eyes flicked toward Vittorio with something close to fear. "There's more?" Elena asked. Nobody answered her. The silence pressed down on the church like a physical weight. Somewhere behind her, a chair scraped against the floor, as one of the guests stood and quietly slipped out, unwilling to witness whatever was coming next. Vittorio took a slow breath and looked at Elena with something that resembled pity, though his face remained composed. Once the marriage was final, the deed to the company would transfer to Daniel's family within 30 days. After that, there was no more use for a wife who knew the truth. Accidents happen. Marriages end. People disappear quietly, and no one asks too many questions when the money involved is this large. The words hung in the air, sharp and impossible to unhear. Elena stared at Daniel, waiting for him to deny it, to laugh, to say the man in the gray suit was lying to frighten her. Instead, Daniel's face had gone completely white, and he said nothing at all. "Get away from me," Elena said, backing away from him entirely now, her wedding dress dragging against the altar steps. "Don't come near me again." "Elena, that's not the plan. I would never let anything happen to you," Daniel said, but his protest came too late and too weak to mean anything. Vittorio stepped between them fully now, his presence enough to make Daniel stop moving forward. "I think the lady has made herself clear." Daniel looked around at the guests, at his own family, at the priest, who stood frozen with his prayer book still open in his hands. Whatever future he had imagined for this day had collapsed entirely, and he seemed to understand that there was no version of the next few minutes that would end well for him. "This isn't over," Daniel muttered, though it sounded more like a man trying to convince himself than a real threat. He turned and walked quickly down the aisle, his family rising to follow him, their faces tight with humiliation and something closer to fear. The church doors closed behind them, and for a moment, no one in the room moved. Elena stood alone at the altar in her wedding dress, the bouquet of white roses and blue hydrangeas still clutched in her shaking hands. 200 guests stared at her, unsure whether to offer comfort or give her space. Her mother finally rose from her seat and rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her daughter, whispering apologies that came far too late to undo anything. "You knew," Elena said quietly into her mother's shoulder. "You knew, and you let me walk down that aisle anyway." "I didn't know everything," her mother said, her voice breaking. "I swear to you, I didn't know about the rest of it. I only knew about the debt." Elena pulled back and looked past her mother, searching the church for the man who had just torn her entire life apart with 3 whispered words. Vittorio stood near the altar steps, watching her with an expression she could not quite read, patient and still, as if he had all the time in the world. "Why did you do this?" Elena asked him, her voice raw. "Why come here, today, in front of everyone? You could have told me privately." "Because Daniel needed the wedding to happen publicly, in front of witnesses, so that no one could question it later," Vittorio said. "If I had come to you quietly, he would have found a way to convince you it was a lie, and you would have married him within the week. This was the only way to stop it before it was too late." Elena studied him carefully, trying to decide if she believed him, trying to decide if a man with his reputation could be trusted at all. "How do I know you aren't lying too? How do I know this isn't some plan of your own?" "You don't," Vittorio said honestly. "Not yet. But your father trusted me once, a long time ago, and I owed him a debt of my own. This was how I chose to repay it." "My father is dead," Elena said. "He can't confirm anything you're saying." "No," Vittorio agreed quietly. "He can't, which means you have every right to be careful with me too." Elena looked down at the bouquet in her hands, the flowers she had chosen so carefully, now trembling with the shake in her fingers. She thought of the vows she had memorized, the life she had imagined with Daniel, all of it built on a lie she had never suspected. Guests began filing out slowly, whispering among themselves, some glancing back at Elena with sympathy, others with barely disguised curiosity, eager to be the first to spread the story of the wedding that fell apart in front of 200 witnesses. Elena barely noticed them leaving. Her entire focus remained on the man standing a few feet away, the stranger who had just saved her from a fate she hadn't known she was walking toward. "What happens now?" Elena asked, more to herself than to him. "Now," Vittorio said, "you decide whether you want to know the rest of the truth, or whether you would rather walk away and try to forget any of this happened." Elena thought of Daniel's face when he had failed to deny the accusation. She thought of her mother's guilty silence. She thought of the company her father had built from nothing, the one she had assumed would simply pass into her own hands someday, not become a bargaining chip in a marriage designed to end with her disappearance. "I want to know everything," Elena said. Vittorio studied her for a long moment, as if weighing whether she truly meant it. Then he gave a small nod. "Then, we should not talk here. Too many ears, too many eyes. There is a car waiting outside. If you want answers, come with me now." Elena hesitated. Every instinct told her that stepping into a car with a man like Vittorio Marchetti on the very day her wedding had collapsed into chaos was reckless beyond reason. But staying meant returning to a family who had hidden the truth from her and a fiancé who had planned to erase her from existence once his signature was secured. She looked down one final time at the ring still resting on her finger, the ring Daniel had placed there with promises she now knew were empty. Slowly, she pulled it off and set it on the altar rail beside her. Then she turned to Vittorio. "Take me somewhere I can hear all of it," she said. "Every last word." Vittorio offered his arm, though he did not force her to take it. Elena looked at it for a moment, then walked past him instead, down the aisle in her wedding dress, out through the same doors he had entered only minutes before. The autumn air outside was sharp and cold against her skin, and for the first time all day, she felt like she could finally breathe. Behind her, the church stood empty of everyone but scattered flowers and abandoned dreams. Ahead of her, a black car waited at the curb, its engine already running, and beyond it, an entire truth she was not yet prepared for. Elena stepped into the unknown, leaving behind the wedding that was never going to save her at all. Inside the car, she pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window and watched the church shrink behind her. A part of her still expected to wake up in her childhood bedroom, the wedding still hours away, the morning still full of nervous excitement instead of fear. But the ache in her chest told her this was real, that the life she had built in her mind over the past 2 years had been made of paper, and paper burned quickly once someone held a flame to it. She thought about the small details that suddenly seemed important now, the way Daniel always checked his phone the moment he thought she wasn't looking, the way his mother had never quite warmed to her despite months of polite dinners, the way his father's questions during their engagement dinner had always circled back to the company, to numbers, to timelines. She had noticed these things and dismissed them, telling herself that every family had its quirks, that no one was perfect, that love meant overlooking small imperfections in the people you cared about. Now she understood that some of those imperfections had never been small at all. They had been warnings, quiet ones, easy to miss if you wanted badly enough to believe in the story you had already decided to live inside. The driver said nothing as the car moved further from the city center, and Elena did not ask where exactly they were headed. She simply watched the streets change, watched the shops give way to quieter roads lined with tall trees, and tried to steady her breathing one measured inhale at a time. Somewhere behind her, her old life waited to be picked apart by gossip and headlines. Somewhere ahead of her, an answer waited, one she was not certain she was ready to hear, but one she knew she could no longer avoid. She thought, too, of her father, gone 18 months now, and wondered what he would say if he could see her sitting in the back of a stranger's car, still wearing traces of a wedding that had fallen apart in minutes. Would he be relieved that she had escaped a fate worse than heartbreak? Or would he grieve for the years of business he had built, years that now seemed tangled in debts and dangers she had never known existed? She wished, more than anything in that moment, that she could ask him directly, instead of relying on the word of a stranger in a tailored suit. The car slowed as it approached the gates of an unfamiliar property, and Elena felt her pulse quicken again, not with the panic of the church, but with a different kind of uncertainty, the uncertainty of standing at the edge of a truth she had asked for, and was now about to receive in full. The car moved through the city streets in silence, the wedding dress bunched awkwardly around Elena's knees in the back seat. She stared out the window, watching familiar streets blur past, streets she had walked 1,000 times, but which now felt entirely unfamiliar, as if the ground beneath her life had shifted and left her standing somewhere new. Vittorio sat across from her, saying nothing, giving her the silence she needed. It was only when the car pulled through a set of iron gates and up a long gravel driveway that he finally spoke. "We will talk inside," he said, "somewhere private." The house was large but not showy, built of gray stone, with ivy climbing one wall. Elena had expected something colder, something that matched the reputation attached to his name, but the inside of the house felt lived in, with books stacked on side tables and a fire already burning in the front room. A woman met them at the door, perhaps in her 50s, with kind eyes and silver hair pulled into a neat bun. "This is Clara," Vittorio said. "She has worked for my family for many years. She will find you something more comfortable to wear." Clara did not ask questions. She simply looked at Elena's wedding dress, at the tear stains on her face, and nodded gently. "Come with me, dear. Let's get you out of that dress." 20 minutes later, Elena sat in the front room, wearing a simple gray sweater and dark trousers Clara had found for her, a cup of tea warming her hands. The fire crackled softly. Vittorio sat across from her, his jacket removed, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, looking less like the imposing figure who had walked into the church, and more like a man who had simply run out of patience for pretending. "Start from the beginning," Elena said. "I want to understand all of it." Vittorio nodded slowly. "Your father, Charles Marlowe, built Marlowe Textiles from almost nothing. You know this part of the story already." "I do," Elena said. "He started with one small factory and grew it into one of the largest textile companies in the region." "What you may not know," Vittorio continued, "is that 7 years ago, your father made a mistake, a costly one. He invested heavily in a shipping partnership that fell apart within months, and the company nearly collapsed. He needed money quickly, more than any bank would offer him without collateral he did not have." Elena frowned. "He never told me any of this." "He wouldn't have wanted you to know," Vittorio said. "He came to my family for a loan, not the kind you find in a bank brochure, the kind that comes with different rules, different expectations. My father agreed to help him, on the condition that the debt would be repaid within a reasonable time, with interest, like any other business arrangement." "And did he repay it?" "Most of it," Vittorio said. "Your father was a proud man. He worked for years to pay down what he owed, and by the time he passed, the debt was nearly gone. A small amount remained, manageable, nothing that should have caused any of what happened today." Elena set her tea down carefully. "Then how does Daniel fit into any of this?" Vittorio leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "This is where it becomes more complicated. The remaining debt was never owed to my family directly. It had been sold, passed along to another group. one with far less patience and far less honor than my father had shown yours. The man who purchased that debt is named Edward Whitfield. Daniel's father, Elena said quietly. Daniel's father, Vittorio confirmed. Edward Whitfield runs a shipping and logistics business that looks entirely legitimate on the surface. Underneath, it survives by buying up debts like your father's and using them as leverage. When Edward learned that Charles Marlowe's daughter was unmarried and set to inherit a company worth far more than the remaining debt, he saw an opportunity. Elena felt sick. So Daniel was never interested in me at all. I was a business transaction from the very beginning. I cannot speak to what Daniel felt, Vittorio said carefully, but I can tell you what was planned. Edward arranged for his son to meet you, to court you, to become close enough that marriage would seem like the natural next step. Once you were married, the remaining debt would be forgiven in exchange for a controlling share of Marlowe Textiles being transferred into Whitfield hands. And what happens to me once the shares transfer? Elena asked, though part of her already knew the answer from what Vittorio had said in the church. Companies like Marlowe Textiles are worth more than the debt itself, Vittorio said. Once Edward Whitfield controlled a majority share, he intended to sell the company in pieces to competitors, keeping only the profitable divisions and stripping the rest for parts. As for you, once the transfer was legally complete, you would no longer serve any purpose to him. A convenient accident, perhaps a car crash on a quiet road, would remove you from the picture entirely, leaving Daniel as the grieving widower who inherited everything without complication. The fire popped softly in the silence that followed. Elena stared into the flames, trying to absorb the enormity of what she had just been told. Somewhere in the past 2 years, she had fallen in love with a man who had been sent to end her life, once he no longer needed her. How do you know all of this? Elena asked finally. How could you possibly know the details of a plan this specific? Vittorio's expression grew more careful. Because my family has been watching the Whitfields for a long time. They have crossed paths with people I care about before, and their methods have cost lives in the past. When I learned that Edward's son was engaged to Charles Marlowe's daughter, I began investigating. It did not take long to uncover the plan. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Why wait until the day of the wedding? I tried, Vittorio said. 3 weeks ago, I sent someone to speak with you privately. Someone I trusted to explain the situation calmly, away from any pressure. That man was found in the river 2 days later. The Whitfields do not tolerate interference easily, and they made certain no one else would try to warn you quietly. Elena's hand rose to her mouth. Someone died because of this? Because of me? Because of them, Vittorio corrected gently. Not because of you. You did nothing wrong except trust the people around you, which is not a crime, only a kindness that was exploited. What was his name? Elena asked quietly. The man who tried to warn me. Vittorio hesitated, as if weighing whether the answer would help her or simply add another weight to carry. Henry, he said finally. He worked for my family for almost 20 years. He had a wife and a young daughter, and he volunteered for the assignment himself because he believed strongly that no one deserved to walk into a marriage built on a lie without at least the chance to say no. Does his family know why he died? They know he died protecting someone, Vittorio said. They do not know the specifics, and I would prefer to keep it that way for their own safety, at least until the Whitfields no longer pose a threat to anyone connected to this situation. Elena absorbed this in silence, feeling the full weight of a stranger's sacrifice settle over her shoulders. She had not asked for protection, she had not even known she needed it, and yet a man with a wife and a daughter had given his life, trying to spare her from a fate she had never suspected, was waiting for her. I want to meet them someday, Elena said, his wife and his daughter, when this is over, when it's safe. I want them to know I understand what was given for me, even if I can't repay it. That is a kind instinct, Vittorio said, though I would caution you to wait until the danger has fully passed. Right now, any connection to this situation, even a well-meaning one, could put them at further risk. Elena nodded, filing the promise away for a future she hoped would arrive safely. The fire crackled again, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of Henry's sacrifice settling into the quiet room like another guest who had joined them uninvited. Elena sat in silence for a long moment, processing the weight of everything she had learned. The fire continued to burn, and outside the window, the afternoon light had begun to shift toward evening, the day's chaos far from over despite how much had already happened. "What happens now?" Elena asked. "Daniel knows I've learned the truth. His family knows. What do they do next?" "That is what concerns me most," Vittorio admitted. "Edward Whitfield does not simply walk away from a plan this carefully built. He has spent months, perhaps longer, arranging every piece of this. Losing you today means losing access to Marlowe Textiles entirely, and men like him do not accept failure easily. Are you saying I'm still in danger?" "I am saying you should assume you are, until we know otherwise," Vittorio said. "The safest place for you right now is somewhere Edward cannot easily reach, somewhere protected, until we understand what his next move will be." Elena studied him carefully. "And you're offering me that protection?" "I am," Vittorio said simply. "Why?" Elena asked. "You've already told me the debt my father owed to your family was mostly repaid. You have no obligation to me now. Why involve yourself any further?" Vittorio was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Your father helped my family once too, in a way that mattered more than money. When I was young, before I inherited my father's responsibilities, I made a mistake that could have destroyed everything my family had built. Charles Marlowe was one of the few people who helped me fix it, quietly, without ever asking anything in return. I have carried that debt for a long time. Today was not simply about repaying money he owed us. It was about repaying the man himself." Elena absorbed this, studying his face for any sign of deception, finding none that she could identify. "I don't know if I can trust any of this," she admitted. "Everything I believed about my life this morning turned out to be false." "How do I know you're any different?" "You don't have to trust me completely," Vittorio said. "You only have to stay safe while you decide. Clara can prepare a room for you tonight. Tomorrow, if you want to return to your own life and take your chances with the Whitfields, I will not stop you. But I would ask you to consider staying, at least until we understand what Edward intends to do next." Elena looked toward the window, thinking of her mother's house, of the wedding dress still crumpled somewhere in this stranger's home, of the life she had imagined only hours ago that had crumbled apart so completely. She thought of the man who had died trying to warn her, a stranger who had given his life for a truth she hadn't even known to ask for. "One night," Elena said finally. "I'll stay one night, then I need to see my mother, and I need to understand what happens with the company." "That seems fair," Vittorio said. Clara appeared in the doorway then, as if she had been listening for the right moment to interrupt. "Dinner is nearly ready, if you're both hungry. And Elena, dear, I've prepared the guest room at the end of the East Hall. There are fresh clothes waiting for you as well." Elena managed a small, tired smile. "Thank you, Clara." As Clara disappeared back toward the kitchen, Elena turned back to Vittorio. "There's something I still don't understand. If the Whitfields believed I was central to their plan, why would Daniel's family risk exposing everything by continuing to pursue me publicly today? Oak, surely they knew you might interfere." "They did not expect me to reveal everything so directly," Vittorio said. "Edward believed his son could manage you, could explain away any suspicion with enough charm and reassurance. He underestimated how much you would question once the truth started to unravel. That miscalculation may work in our favor now, but it also means he will move more carefully going forward, which makes him more dangerous, not less." A quiet knock came at the front door, sharp and unexpected. Vittorio's posture shifted immediately, alert in a way that made Elena's pulse quicken. He rose from his chair and moved toward the window, glancing through the curtain before relaxing slightly. "It's Nathan," he said. "One of my men. He wouldn't come here without reason." He opened the door, and a younger man stepped inside, his expression tense, his eyes flicking briefly to Elena, before returning to Vittorio. "We have a problem," Nathan said. "Edward Whitfield called an emergency meeting with his board an hour ago. The word is he's already filed paperwork claiming Elena breached a private agreement by walking away from the wedding. He's trying to argue there was a binding contract tied to the company's transfer, separate from the marriage itself." Elena stood up quickly. "That's insane. There was no contract. I never signed anything." Your father may have, Nathan said carefully. Years ago, when he first took the loan. There may have been language in the original agreement that Edward is trying to twist now that the marriage fell apart. Vittorio's jaw tightened. Get me a copy of that original agreement tonight. I want to see exactly what your father signed, Elena, before Edward finds a way to use it against you in court. Court? Elena repeated. He's threatening to sue me? Worse, Nathan said. He's threatening to claim ownership of Marlowe Textiles directly, arguing the debt was never truly settled, and that the wedding was simply a formality, to finalize what was already legally his. Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her again, the same dizzying sensation she had felt standing at the altar only hours before. Everything she had believed about her father's company, her own future, her own safety, seemed to be unraveling faster than she could process it. This isn't just about a wedding anymore, she said quietly. This is about my entire inheritance, everything my father built. Yes, Vittorio said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. Which means we don't have the luxury of waiting to see what Edward does next. We need to move first. He turned to Nathan. Get the lawyers working tonight. I want every document related to Charles Marlowe's original loan reviewed by morning. And increase security around this house. If Edward is willing to manufacture a legal claim this quickly, he may be willing to take more direct action as well. Nathan nodded and left as quickly as he had arrived, the door closing softly behind him. Elena stood in the center of the room, her tea long forgotten, her mind racing through implications she hadn't considered even an hour ago. Vittorio watched her carefully, seeming to understand the weight of what she was processing. I know this is a lot to take in, he said, but I need you to understand something clearly. Edward Whitfield is not a man who loses gracefully. He built his entire plan around controlling your father's company, and he will not simply walk away because his son's engagement collapsed. The fight you thought ended at the altar this morning has only just begun. Elena looked at him, feeling something shift inside her, some combination of fear and determination she hadn't expected to find so soon after everything had fallen apart. Then tell me what I need to do, she said. Because I am not losing my father's company to the same family that planned to marry me, only to erase me once they no longer needed me. Vittorio studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering across his expression. That, he said, is exactly the answer I was hoping to hear. Clara returned a short while later to announce that dinner had grown cold waiting for them, and the conversation shifted, if only briefly, away from lawsuits and old debts. Over a simple meal of roasted vegetables and fresh bread, Elena found herself asking Vittorio questions she would never have imagined asking a stranger only a day earlier. About his childhood, about the mother he rarely mentioned, about the weight of inheriting responsibilities so much larger than himself, at an age when most people were still finishing school. My mother left when I was 9, Vittorio said, his voice carefully even, though something flickered behind his eyes that suggested the memory still carried weight even after so many years. She did not want the life my father's world demanded of her. I do not blame her for choosing to leave, though I understand why my father never fully forgave it. Did she ever try to see you again? Elena asked gently. A few letters, when I was younger, nothing after I turned 16. Vittorio set down his fork, his expression thoughtful rather than bitter. I used to resent her for it. Now I mostly understand her. This life is not one anyone chooses easily, and staying inside it requires a kind of acceptance that not everyone can find. And you found it, Elena said. That acceptance. I found a version of it, Vittorio said. One that allows me to sleep most nights, and to look at myself honestly most mornings. That has to be enough, because there is no undoing the responsibilities I was born into. Elena considered this, thinking of her own father, of the quiet pressure he must have carried building Marlowe Textiles from nothing, while raising a daughter he clearly wanted to shield from the harder truths of business and survival. I think our fathers might have understood each other better than either of us realized, she said. Both of them carrying weight they never fully explained to the people who loved them. Vittorio looked at her with something like surprise, as if the observation had struck a chord he hadn't expected a near stranger to reach so quickly. Perhaps, he said, perhaps that is part of why he trusted me all those years ago. Men who carry the same kind of weight tend to recognize it in each other, even across very different worlds. They finished the meal in a companionable quiet that felt strange given the chaos of the day, but not unwelcome. For the first time since the church doors had opened, Elena felt something other than fear settle into her chest, something small and fragile, but real. Outside, the last light of the day faded into evening, and somewhere across the city, in an office far removed from the chaos of the church, Edward Whitfield sat reviewing documents by lamplight, already calculating his next move against a daughter who refused to disappear quietly. The war for Marlowe Textiles, and for Elena's life, had only just begun. Later that night, unable to sleep, Elena wandered down to the kitchen for a glass of water and found Clara still awake, sitting at the small wooden table with a cup of tea and a half-finished crossword puzzle. Clara looked up and offered a warm smile, gesturing for Elena to sit. "Trouble sleeping, dear. Not surprising, given the day you've had. I keep replaying everything," Elena admitted, sinking into the chair across from her. "The wedding, the journal entries, the lawsuit. It feels like too much for 1 week to hold." Clara reached across the table and patted her hand gently. "In my experience, the weeks that feel unbearable in the moment are often the ones that end up shaping a person the most. Not because the pain is good, but because surviving it teaches you things gentler weeks never could." "Have you known Vittorio long?" Elena asked, curious despite the exhaustion pulling at her. "Since he was a boy," Clara said, a fondness creeping into her voice. "I came to work in this house when his mother was still here, before she left. I watched him grow from a frightened child who used to hide in the garden shed whenever his father raised his voice, into the man who walked into your church today without a flicker of fear on his face." "He seemed very composed," Elena agreed. "Almost too composed, given everything he was telling me." "That composure is armor," Clara said simply. "He learned early that showing fear in his father's world meant becoming a target. It does not mean he does not feel things deeply, dear. It only means he has learned to hide it well. You would do well to remember that, especially in the days ahead." Elena considered this quietly, thinking of the brief moments that evening when Vittorio's careful expression had cracked, just slightly, revealing something more vulnerable underneath. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara studied her for a long moment before answering. "Because I have watched a great many people pass through this house over the years, dear, and I have learned to recognize when something different is happening. You looked at him tonight, the way people look at someone they are beginning to trust, in a way they did not expect to trust anyone again so soon. I simply wanted you to understand what that composure costs him, in case it ever matters to you." Elena did not know how to respond, so she simply thanked Clara for the tea and the conversation, and made her way back upstairs, Clara's words settling into her thoughts, alongside everything else she had learned, that long, impossible day. Sleep, when it finally came, arrived slowly, tangled with images of church doors and whispered warnings, and a man in a gray suit who had somehow become the only steady thing in a world that had otherwise collapsed entirely around her. Elena woke before dawn, disoriented for a moment in the unfamiliar room, the soft gray light filtering through heavy curtains she did not recognize. Then the memory of the previous day rushed back all at once. The church, the whispered warning, the truth about Daniel and his father, and she sat up quickly, her heart pounding as if she had never truly slept at all. She found Vittorio already awake downstairs, seated at a long table in what appeared to be a study, surrounded by stacks of paper. A man she didn't recognize sat beside him, reading glasses perched on his nose, flipping through documents with quick, practiced hands. "This is Peter," Vittorio said without looking up. "He has handled legal matters for my family for over a decade. He worked through the night, reviewing your father's original loan agreement." Peter glanced up and offered Elena a brief, tired smile. "Please, sit. You'll want to hear this." Elena lowered herself into the chair across from them, her stomach tightening with anticipation. "Tell me the worst of it first." "The worst of it," Peter said, "is that Edward Whitfield is not entirely wrong that there was language in the original agreement tying repayment terms to a potential marriage. Your father was desperate 7 years ago, and desperate men sometimes sign clauses they never expect to matter." Elena's chest tightened. "So he can claim the company?" "Not quite," Peter said, holding up a hand. "The clause is vague, deliberately so, most likely because your father's own lawyer at the time understood how dangerous such language could be and softened it wherever possible. It states that in the event of marriage between the families, certain shares would transfer as part of a broader debt resolution. It does not specify percentages. It does not specify which family member must marry whom, and most importantly, it requires the marriage to be completed, not merely attempted. The wedding never finished, Elena said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. Exactly, Peter said. No vows were exchanged. No marriage certificate was signed. Legally, nothing occurred beyond an engagement that ended publicly, and, frankly, embarrassingly, for the Whitfield family. Edward's claim has almost no legal foundation, but that will not stop him from filing anyway. Men like him use lawsuits as weapons, not as genuine legal arguments. He wants to tie up the company in court, drain your resources, and pressure you into a settlement out of exhaustion. Elena exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders, though not all of it. So what do? We fight back immediately and publicly, Vittorio said. We do not let him control the narrative. If he files a claim, we respond within hours, not days. We make it clear that any legal action will be met with equal force, and we let his own board members see how weak his position actually is. If Peter nodded in agreement. I've already drafted a response we can file the moment his claim appears. But Elena, I need to ask you something important. Do you have access to any of your father's other business records? Personal notes, private correspondence, anything that might clarify his original intentions when he signed this agreement? Elena thought for a moment. There's a study in my mother's house. My father kept boxes of old papers there after he retired from daily operations. I haven't gone through most of it since he passed. We should look through it as soon as possible, Peter said. If there's anything that strengthens our position, we need to find it before Edward's lawyers think to ask the same question. Vittorio glanced at Elena. Are you comfortable going back to your mother's house today? I can arrange for Nathan to accompany you, along with 2 others for additional security. Elena hesitated. Part of her wanted to refuse, to insist she could manage on her own, that she was not someone who needed protection like a piece of fragile property. But she thought of the man who had died trying to warn her weeks ago, and she understood that pride was a luxury she could not currently afford. Yes, she said, I want to go today. The drive to her mother's house felt strange, familiar streets now viewed through the window of an armored car, with 2 additional vehicles trailing behind for security. Elena watched the city pass by, thinking of how different everything had looked only 24 hours earlier, when her biggest concern had been whether the flowers would arrive on time. Her mother met her at the door, eyes red from crying, arms opening immediately to pull Elena into an embrace. I've been calling all morning. I didn't know where you'd gone. I was so frightened. I'm safe, Mom, Elena said, though even she wasn't entirely certain that was true. I need to look through Dad's old study. It's important. Her mother's expression shifted to confusion, then understanding. This is about the company, isn't it? About what that man said in the church. His name is Vittorio, Elena said. And yes, it's about the company. I need to find anything that might help protect it. Her mother led her upstairs to a room Elena hadn't entered in months. Dust settled over stacks of boxes her father had left behind. Sunlight filtered weakly through gauzy curtains, illuminating particles floating in the air, undisturbed for far too long. Elena began opening boxes methodically, sorting through old contracts, personal letters, photographs of factory openings from decades earlier. Nathan waited by the door, giving her privacy, while remaining close enough to respond quickly if needed. Her mother sat quietly in the corner, watching, occasionally reaching for a photograph and holding it against her chest, before setting it carefully aside. An hour passed with little progress. Elena's fingers ached from handling brittle paper, her eyes burning from dust and concentration. Then, near the bottom of the 4th box, she found a leather journal, its cover cracked with age, her father's handwriting visible on the inside cover. Mom, Elena said quietly, did you know about this? Her mother shook her head, leaning forward to look at the journal in Elena's hands. I didn't. Your father kept things from me sometimes, especially near the end, when the business troubles were at their worst. Elena opened the journal carefully, flipping through pages filled with her father's small, neat handwriting. Most entries concerned daily business matters, meetings, factory production numbers, nothing unusual. But near the middle of the journal, an entry caught her attention, dated 7 years earlier, around the time Peter had mentioned the loan was first taken. She read it aloud slowly. Met with Marchetti today. Difficult conversation, but he treated me with more respect than I deserved, given the circumstances. Agreed to terms that should allow us to survive this. Vittorio, the son, seemed uncomfortable with some of what his father proposed. I suspect he will be a different kind of man when he takes over the family business. I hope I am alive to see it. Elena's throat tightened at her father's words, at the small window into a version of him she had never known, a man navigating desperate circumstances with more awareness than she had realized. She continued flipping through the pages, and several entries later, found something that made her breath catch entirely. Edward Whitfield approached me today, claiming interest in purchasing a portion of my remaining debt from the Marchetti family. Something about the offer troubles me deeply. He asked pointed questions about Elena, about her age, whether she was seeing anyone seriously. I do not trust this man's intentions. I have decided to refuse his offer, though I suspect he will find another way to acquire the debt regardless of my wishes. He knew, Elena whispered. My father knew Edward Whitfield was interested in me, years before Daniel and I ever met. Nathan stepped closer from the doorway, his expression sharpening with interest. This is significant. If your father documented Edward's intentions before you even knew Daniel, it proves premeditation. It supports everything Vittorio told you yesterday, and it will matter enormously if this ends up in front of a judge. Elena continued reading, her hands trembling slightly as she turned each page, searching for anything else her father might have recorded. The final relevant entry, dated only months before his death, read simply, "If anything happens to me before this debt is settled, I want Elena protected from Edward Whitfield entirely. She must never be used as a bargaining piece in whatever remains unpaid. I have spoken with Marchetti about this. He has given me his word." Elena looked up at Nathan, stunned. Vittorio knew about this. My father asked him directly to protect me. I wasn't aware of this specific conversation, Nathan admitted, but it doesn't surprise me. Vittorio takes matters of honor very seriously, especially when it involves keeping his word to someone he respected. Elena's mother rose slowly from her seat in the corner, moving closer to look over Elena's shoulder at the journal entry. She read it twice, her lips pressed into a thin line, before finally speaking. Your father told me once, near the end, that he had made arrangements to protect you if anything ever happened to him. I assumed he meant a will, life insurance, the ordinary things a father arranges for his family. I never imagined he meant something like this. Would it have changed anything if you had known? Elena asked. Her mother considered the question honestly. I don't know. Perhaps I would have looked at Daniel more carefully from the beginning. Perhaps I would have asked harder questions when his family seemed so eager for the engagement to move quickly. I wanted to believe you had found happiness, Elena. I think I let that wanting blind me to things I should have noticed. We can't change what we missed, Elena said gently, surprising herself with the compassion in her own voice, given how betrayed she still felt by the silence her mother had kept. We can only decide what to do with what we know now. Her mother nodded, wiping at her eyes before composing herself again. Then let's finish going through these boxes. If your father left one warning behind, there may be others. They spent another half-hour searching, uncovering nothing as significant as the journal, though Elena did find a small stack of old photographs, her father standing beside a much younger Vittorio at what appeared to be a business dinner years earlier, both men smiling in a way that suggested genuine warmth rather than obligation. She tucked the photograph carefully into her bag alongside the journal, a small piece of evidence that the trust between their families had run deeper and longer than she had initially understood. Elena closed the journal carefully, holding it against her chest the way her mother had held the old photographs. Something about discovering her father's private thoughts, his fear for her safety, recorded years before any of this had unfolded, made the entire situation feel less like a sudden crisis and more like a plan that had been building toward this moment for a very long time. They were preparing to leave, journals secured safely in Elena's bag, when Nathan's phone rang sharply. He answered quickly, his expression shifting from calm to alert within seconds. "We need to leave now," he said, ending the call abruptly. "Vittorio just received word that Edward's men were spotted near this neighborhood 20 minutes ago. It could be nothing, but we're not taking chances." Elena's mother gasped softly. "Near my house? Elena, what is happening?" "I'll explain everything soon, Mom, I promise," Elena said, already moving toward the stairs, journal clutched tightly against her side. "Right now, we need to go." They moved quickly through the house, Nathan leading with careful, practiced steps, checking windows and hallways, before allowing Elena to pass through each area. Just as they reached the front door, Nathan froze, one hand raised to stop Elena from moving further. Through the front window, a dark sedan had pulled up across the street, parked in a way that suggested someone had no intention of simply driving past. "Back door," Nathan said quietly. "Now." Elena's pulse raced as she followed him through the kitchen toward a side entrance she barely remembered existed, her mother close behind, breathing hard with fear rather than exertion. Nathan checked the exit carefully before ushering them both through, moving quickly along the side of the house toward the waiting security vehicle, parked discreetly around the corner. They were nearly to the car when a man stepped out from behind a hedge, blocking their path entirely. Elena froze, recognizing him instantly as one of Daniel's groomsmen from the wedding, though his expression now held none of the pleasant warmth she remembered from the rehearsal dinner only days earlier. "Elena," the man said, his voice carrying a false calm that did nothing to disguise the tension underneath. "Edward would like to speak with you. Just a conversation, nothing more." "Get out of the way," Nathan said, stepping in front of Elena and her mother, his voice low and dangerous in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "This doesn't concern you," the man said to Nathan, though his eyes remained fixed on Elena. "This is a family matter." "She is not your family," Nathan said. "Not anymore. Step aside." For a tense moment, no one moved. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the standoff, uncertain what would happen next, painfully aware of how quickly the world had shifted from wedding planning to threats waiting behind garden hedges. Then, from further down the street, Elena heard the sound of another car approaching quickly, tires gripping pavement with urgency. The man by the hedge glanced toward the sound, his confidence faltering slightly, as a second security vehicle pulled up, two more of Vittorio's men stepping out, with expressions that left little room for negotiation. "This isn't over," the man said, echoing the same tired threat Daniel had offered at the church the previous day, before turning and walking briskly back toward the sedan parked across the street. Elena watched it pull away, her hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. For a moment, no one spoke. Elena's mother stood frozen beside the hedge, her hand pressed against her chest as if trying to steady her own heartbeat through sheer force of will. Nathan kept his eyes on the street long after the sedan had disappeared around the corner, his posture still tense, still ready for a threat that might return without warning. "Into the car," Nathan finally said, his voice firm but calm. "Both of you. We're not staying here a moment longer than necessary." Elena helped her mother into the back seat, noticing the way her hands trembled as she gripped the door handle, the way her breath came in short, shallow bursts that spoke of fear rather than exertion. Once the doors were closed and the car pulled away from the curb, her mother finally broke the silence. "That man knew your name," she said quietly. "He knew exactly where to find you. How long has this been happening, Elena? How long have people been watching us without our knowledge?" "I don't know," Elena admitted. "Longer than I realized, apparently. Vittorio said Edward has been planning this for months, maybe longer." "And you trust this Vittorio," her mother said. Not quite a question, not quite an accusation. A man whose name alone made half the church go silent when he walked in. Elena considered the question honestly before answering. "I trust him more than I trusted Daniel, and Daniel spent 2 years earning trust he never deserved. Vittorio has been honest with me since the moment he walked into that church, even when the truth was difficult to hear. That has to count for something." Her mother was quiet for a long moment, watching the city pass by outside the window. "Your father used to speak of him occasionally, you know. Not often, and never in great detail. But I remember him once saying that if anything ever happened to him, There was a man he trusted to look out for our family's interests. I assumed he meant a lawyer, or perhaps an old business partner. I never imagined he meant someone from that world. Would it have changed your feelings, knowing Dad trusted someone like Vittorio? Elena asked. I'm not certain, her mother admitted. Your father built his entire life around honest, hard work. The idea that he might have relied on someone from a more dangerous world always unsettled me, even when I understood the necessity of it. But watching what happened today, watching how quickly that man's people responded to protect us, I find myself grateful rather than unsettled. Perhaps that makes me a hypocrite. It makes you human, Elena said gently. None of us expected any of this a week ago. Are you all right? Nathan asked, turning to check on both Elena and her mother. I think so, Elena managed, though her voice wavered. Is this what my life is going to look like now? People blocking my path in my own neighborhood? Until this is resolved, yes, Nathan said honestly, which is exactly why staying somewhere secure matters more than ever. They drove back to Vittorio's house in tense silence, Elena's mother insisting on coming along despite Elena's protests that she should return to her own home. I am not leaving you alone after what just happened, her mother said firmly, and Elena did not have the energy to argue further. Vittorio met them at the door, his expression darkening as Nathan explained what had occurred outside Elena's mother's house. This confirms what I feared, Vittorio said. Edward is not waiting to see how the legal claim unfolds. He's already trying to intimidate you directly. He sent someone to talk to me, Elena said. Not to hurt me, at least not obviously. Today, Vittorio said grimly. Men like Edward test boundaries slowly at first. A conversation today, something more forceful tomorrow, if the conversation doesn't achieve what he wants. I won't allow this to escalate further without response. Elena held up her father's journal. I found something that might help. My father knew about Edward's interest in me years before any of this happened. He wrote about it in detail, and he specifically asked you to protect me if anything happened to him. Vittorio's expression shifted, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, as he took the journal carefully from her hands. He read the final entry silently, his jaw tightening as he absorbed his own name written in Charles Marlowe's careful handwriting. He never told me he wrote this down, Vittorio said quietly. I made him a promise, yes, quietly, months before he passed. I didn't realize he had documented it so clearly. Why didn't you tell me sooner that my father specifically asked you to protect me? Elena asked. Yesterday, you spoke about repaying an old debt, about honor. You never mentioned this. Because I didn't want you to feel like an obligation, Vittorio said. I wanted you to trust me, because you chose to, not because you felt bound by a promise made between your father and me, before you even understood what was happening. Whatever protection I offer you now, I want it to mean something more than simply fulfilling a dying man's request. Elena studied him carefully, surprised by the honesty in his answer, by the way his composed exterior had cracked slightly to reveal something more genuine underneath. That's a strange kind of honor, she said softly, hiding the full truth to protect my feelings. Perhaps, Vittorio admitted, though I suspect you've had enough people hide truths from you this week to last a lifetime. I won't add to that list any further. From this point forward, you'll know everything I know, as soon as I know it. Elena's mother watched this exchange from across the room, her expression softening slightly, despite the fear still evident in her posture. You truly intend to protect my daughter, she said to Vittorio, not quite a question. I do, Vittorio said simply. For as long as it takes to ensure Edward Whitfield can never threaten her again. That evening, after her mother had reluctantly agreed to stay in a guest room down the hall rather than return to a house that was no longer safe, Elena found herself back in the study with Vittorio, reviewing the journal entries together late into the night. The fire crackled steadily beside them, casting warm light across the pages as they worked. Your father was a careful man, Vittorio observed, flipping through another section of the journal. He documented far more than most people would think to record, almost as if he suspected he might need this evidence someday. He always kept detailed records, Elena said. Even when I was young, he would write everything down, every meeting, every decision. I used to think it was excessive. Now I understand why. Vittorio glanced up at her, something gentle in his expression that hadn't been there during their earlier conversations. "You're handling all of this remarkably well, considering everything that's happened in the span of a single day." "I don't feel like I'm handling it well," Elena admitted. "I feel like I'm barely keeping my feet under me. Yesterday, I was planning to marry a man I loved. Today, I've learned he never truly existed, that his entire family plotted against me for years, and that people I trusted knew pieces of the truth and said nothing." "For what it's worth," Vittorio said quietly, "the version of Daniel you loved may have been partially real. Men raised inside families like the Whitfields often convince themselves their intentions are pure, even while participating in plans they know are wrong. That doesn't excuse what he did. It only means your feelings for him weren't entirely foolish, even if his actions were unforgivable." Elena considered this for a long moment, watching the fire dance across the pages of her father's journal. "You didn't have to say that," she said finally. "You could have simply let me believe I was a fool for trusting him." "You weren't a fool," Vittorio said firmly. "You trusted someone who worked very hard to earn that trust dishonestly. There's a difference." The conversation drifted into more comfortable territory as the night wore on, Elena asking questions about Vittorio's own history, about his father, about the responsibilities he had inherited far earlier than he had expected. He answered carefully, but honestly, revealing pieces of himself she hadn't anticipated finding beneath the composed exterior he presented to the world. By the time Elena finally retired to her room, exhaustion pulling at every part of her body, she found herself thinking not of Daniel, nor of the wedding that never happened, but of the quiet honesty in Vittorio's voice when he had promised to keep nothing from her. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the middle of everything else unfolding around her, but it felt like the first true thing anyone had offered her in a very long time. The next morning brought a visitor Elena had not expected. Sophie, Vittorio's younger sister, arrived unannounced shortly after breakfast, her presence announced by the sound of quick, confident footsteps in the hallway, before she appeared in the doorway of the study, dark hair pulled back in a loose braid, an easy smile already forming as she caught sight of Elena. "So you're the one my brother has been so distracted about," Sophie said, dropping into a chair without waiting for an invitation. "I had to see for myself." "Sophie," Vittorio said, a note of warning in his voice that did nothing to dampen his sister's obvious amusement. "Relax," Sophie said, waving a hand dismissively. "I only came to see how the wedding disaster turned out. The whole city is talking about it, you know. Half the guests who were there have already told 3 different versions of the story to anyone who will listen." Elena felt a flush of embarrassment. "I imagine none of the versions are flattering." "Actually, most of them make you sound rather brave," Sophie said, studying Elena with open curiosity. "Standing up to your own fiancé in front of 200 guests takes more nerve than most people have." "I respect that." "I didn't feel brave," Elena admitted. "I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me." "That's usually what bravery feels like from the inside," Sophie said, her tone softening slightly. "It rarely feels like courage in the moment. It only looks like courage afterward, to everyone watching from the outside." Vittorio cleared his throat, clearly eager to redirect the conversation before his sister could embarrass him further. "Sophie, did you come here for a reason beyond satisfying your curiosity?" "Actually, yes," Sophie said, her expression sharpening into something more serious. "I heard from a friend in the finance industry that Edward Whitfield has been meeting with investors this week, trying to secure additional funding, something about needing capital quickly, faster than his usual channels can provide. It might be nothing, but given everything happening with Elena's company, I thought you should know." Vittorio's expression darkened. "That's useful information. Thank you, Sophie." "Any time," Sophie said, rising from her chair and offering Elena a genuine, warm smile, before heading toward the door. "It was nice meeting you, Elena. For what it's worth, my brother has been far less insufferable since you arrived. I'd call that a good sign." She left as quickly as she had appeared, and Elena turned to Vittorio with a raised eyebrow. "Insufferable?" "My sister exaggerates," Vittorio said, though the faint color rising in his cheeks suggested otherwise. "We should focus on what she told us. If Edward is seeking additional funding this quickly, it likely means his original plan is unraveling faster than even we anticipated, and he's searching for alternative ways to recover his losses. Or he's preparing for something else entirely, Elena said quietly, the unease from the earlier confrontation outside her mother's house still fresh in her mind. Something that requires more resources than a simple lawsuit would need. Vittorio met her gaze, the same concern reflected in his expression. We should assume the worst until we know otherwise. I'll have my people look into where exactly Edward is seeking this funding, and why. 3 days passed with a strange, uneasy calm. Elena spent her mornings reviewing legal documents with Peter, her afternoons walking the gardens behind Vittorio's house with her mother, trying to reclaim some sense of normal life, even as security teams patrolled the perimeter with quiet vigilance. Edward Whitfield had not filed his lawsuit yet, and the silence from his side felt less like relief and more like the pause before a storm. It was Vittorio who finally received word that broke the stillness. Daniel wants to meet with you, he told Elena on the 4th evening, finding her in the study where she had taken to spending most of her time. Alone, he says. No lawyers, no security. Elena set down the book she had been pretending to read. Why would I agree to that? You wouldn't, not entirely alone, Vittorio said. But he claims he has information about his father's plans that could help you. Information he's willing to share only if you meet him in person. Do you believe him? Vittorio considered the question carefully. I believe Daniel is frightened. Whatever affection he felt for you, real or manufactured, I don't believe he anticipated his father's plan extending as far as it did. A man who helps arrange his own wife's eventual disappearance does not typically feel comfortable with himself afterward, especially once the wedding has already collapsed and he has nothing left to gain. So he wants to confess, Elena said, ease his conscience. Possibly, Vittorio said. Or possibly, it's a trap designed by his father to lure you somewhere less protected. I won't pretend both possibilities aren't equally likely. Elena thought about it for a long moment, weighing her own safety against the possibility of information that might finally end the threat hanging over her. If I agree to see him, it needs to be somewhere you control completely, somewhere Edward can't reach. I already have a location in mind, Vittorio said. A restaurant, owned by a man who owes me a favor, private room, only one entrance, and I'll have people positioned outside without Daniel knowing they're there. The following afternoon, Elena sat in a quiet private dining room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the door with an anxiety she couldn't quite suppress. Vittorio waited outside with 2 of his men, close enough to intervene, but far enough to give the conversation genuine privacy. Daniel arrived alone, looking nothing like the confident groom who had stood beside her at the altar days earlier. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, his usually immaculate appearance replaced by wrinkled clothes and unshaven stubble along his jaw. Thank you for coming, he said, sitting across from her carefully, as if unsure whether she might leave at any moment. You have 5 minutes, Elena said coldly. Tell me what you came to say. Daniel nodded, swallowing hard before speaking. My father is furious. Not just about the wedding falling apart, but about how publicly it happened. How many witnesses saw everything unravel. He's under enormous pressure from his own investors to recover the losses this failure represents. That's not information, Elena said. That's an excuse. Give me something real. Daniel hesitated, glancing toward the closed door as if checking for eavesdroppers before lowering his voice further. My father is planning something with the factory workers at Marlowe Textiles. He's been quietly meeting with a few senior managers, offering them incentives to support a hostile takeover through shareholder votes rather than the courts. If he can convince enough shareholders that the company is unstable without new leadership, he might be able to force a sale without ever needing the marriage contract to hold up legally. Elena's stomach twisted. Which managers? I don't know all the names, Daniel admitted. But I know he's already spoken with someone in the finance department, someone with access to shareholder records. He's building a case that the company is financially unstable, exaggerating minor issues into something that sounds far worse than reality. Why are you telling me this? Elena asked, studying his face carefully for any sign of deception. What do you gain from betraying your own father? Daniel's composure cracked slightly, his hands trembling against the table. because I never wanted any of this to go this far. When my father first proposed the arrangement, he told me it was simply a business marriage, that you would be provided for, that nothing bad would happen to you. I didn't know about the rest of it, about what he planned once the shares transferred, not until Vittorio said it out loud in the church. I swear to you, Elena, I didn't know. You expect me to believe that, Elena said, though something in his voice, some raw and genuine fear, made her hesitate before dismissing him entirely. I don't expect anything, Daniel said. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know whatever I felt for you doesn't erase what I was willing to let happen, but I couldn't let him hurt you without at least trying to warn you what's coming next. Elena studied him for a long moment, torn between disgust and a small, reluctant flicker of understanding. Whatever Daniel had been to her once, the man sitting across from her now seemed genuinely frightened, genuinely regretful, even if regret arrived far too late to undo any damage already done. If you're telling the truth, Elena said carefully, you need to give me names, actual evidence, not vague warnings. Otherwise, this conversation means nothing. Daniel reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table toward her. This is a list of the managers my father has approached, along with dates of the meetings I overheard. It's not everything, but it's a start. Elena took the paper carefully, unfolding it to find several names written in Daniel's handwriting, along with dates spanning the past 2 months. One name in particular caught her attention immediately. Grace Bellamy, Elena read aloud. She's been with the company for 15 years. My father trusted her completely. People change when enough money is offered, Daniel said quietly. My father is very good at finding the right amount. Elena folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her bag, her mind already racing through the implications of what she had just learned. If Edward Whitfield had already turned senior employees against the company, the threat extended far beyond a simple legal dispute over an old debt. Is there anything else? She asked. Daniel hesitated again, his eyes dropping to the table. Only one more thing. My father knows you're staying with Vittorio Marchetti. He views this as a personal insult, not just a business obstacle. The Marchetti and Whitfield families have history that goes back further than either of us understood. This isn't only about the company anymore, Elena. It's become something much more personal for him. What kind of history? I don't know all the details, Daniel admitted. But I know my father lost something significant to Vittorio's family years ago. Something he's never forgiven. Your involvement with Vittorio has made this entire situation feel like a second loss to him, and my father does not handle losing well. Elena absorbed this information carefully, filing it away alongside everything else she had learned over the past several days. The picture forming in her mind grew more complicated with every new piece of information, layers of old grudges and new schemes intertwining, in ways she was only beginning to understand. Elena studied the list again, memorizing the names before folding it back into her bag. There's something I still don't understand. If you knew about all of this weeks ago, why wait until now to say anything? Why let the wedding get as far as the church before finding a way to stop it yourself? Daniel's shoulders sagged, the weight of the question visibly pressing down on him. I told myself I could manage it from the inside, that if I married you, I could protect you from the worst of what my father intended, that I could find a way to quietly ensure you were never actually in danger, even if the company changed hands. I convinced myself that was possible, right up until Vittorio said the truth out loud in front of everyone. Hearing it spoken aloud, in front of 200 people, made me realize how foolish that plan had always been. I was never going to be able to control my father. No one has ever been able to control my father. That's a convenient realization to have after everything already fell apart, Elena said, though her voice carried less anger now than it had at the beginning of their conversation. I know, Daniel said quietly. I know it doesn't undo anything. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Elena. I'm asking you to be careful. Whatever you think of me now, I don't want to see you hurt, because I was too much of a coward to stop this sooner. Thank you for telling me this, Elena said finally, rising from her chair. Whatever happens next, I hope you find a way out of your father's influence, before it destroys whatever is left of who you actually are. Daniel looked up at her, something like genuine sorrow crossing his features. I hope you find happiness, Elena. whatever that looks like now. You deserve far better than what my family tried to do to you." Elena left the private room without responding further, finding Vittorio waiting exactly where she had left him, his expression sharpening as he took in her troubled expression. "What did he tell you?" Vittorio asked. Elena handed him the folded paper, watching his face darken as he scanned the names and dates. "He says his father is trying to turn senior employees against the company, building a case for a hostile takeover through shareholder votes, rather than the courts." "Grace Bellamy," Vittorio said, reading the name aloud with visible concern. "She oversees the company's financial records. If she's been compromised, Edward could manufacture whatever numbers he needs to convince shareholders the company is failing." "Daniel also said something about history between your family and the Whitfields," Elena said. "Something Edward lost to your family years ago. Something personal, not just business." Vittorio's expression grew guarded, a careful stillness settling over his features that Elena had learned to recognize as deflection. "That's a longer conversation than we have time for right now. We need to address the immediate threat to Marlowe Textiles before anything else." "You're avoiding my question," Elena observed. "I am," Vittorio admitted. "Not because I intend to keep it from you forever, but because some histories are complicated enough that they deserve more attention than we can give them while standing in a restaurant hallway with a potential threat to your company unfolding in real time." Elena wanted to press further, but she recognized the wisdom in his words. Whatever history existed between the Marchetti and Whitfield families, it would still exist tomorrow, next week, whenever there was space to discuss it properly. Right now, protecting her father's company required immediate attention. They returned to Vittorio's house within the hour, Peter already waiting with updated documents spread across the study table, his expression tense as he listened to what Elena and Vittorio had learned. "If Grace Bellamy has been compromised, we need to move quickly," Peter said. "A shareholder vote could be called with as little as 2 weeks' notice, under the company's current bylaws. If Edward has already begun building support, we may have less time than we think." "What can we do?" Elena asked. "First, we need to verify whether Grace has actually agreed to work against the company, or whether she's simply been approached and hasn't decided yet," Peter said. "If there's still time to reach her honestly, she may respond better to the truth about Edward's intentions than to whatever incentives he's offered her." "I'll go see her myself," Elena said. "She's known me since I was a child. If anyone can convince her to reconsider, it should be me." Vittorio looked hesitant. "After what happened outside your mother's house, I'm not comfortable with you moving through the city without significant protection." "Then send protection," Elena said firmly. "But I need to do this myself. Grace deserves to hear the truth from me directly, not from lawyers or security guards. If I'm going to save my father's company, I need to start acting like someone capable of leading it, not someone hiding behind other people's protection indefinitely." Vittorio studied her for a long moment, something like reluctant admiration crossing his expression. "Your father would be proud of that answer," he said finally. "All right, we'll arrange it carefully, with security nearby, but not close enough to intimidate her into silence." As the evening wore on and preparations began for the following day's meeting with Grace Bellamy, Elena found herself standing alone on the balcony outside her room, looking out over the darkened gardens below. The weight of everything unfolding around her felt heavier with each passing hour, layers of betrayal and old grudges stacking higher than she had ever imagined possible only days earlier. Footsteps approached behind her, and she turned to find Vittorio standing in the doorway, his expression softer than the composed mask he wore during their planning sessions. "You should be resting," he said. "Tomorrow will be difficult." "I can't stop thinking about everything," Elena admitted. "My father's company, employees I've known my whole life being manipulated against everything he built, a man I once loved revealing his family, plotted to end my life eventually. It feels like too much to carry all at once." "You don't have to carry it alone," Vittorio said quietly, stepping closer. "Whatever else is true about this situation, you have people around you now who genuinely want to see you succeed. That wasn't true a week ago, when you believed you were simply marrying into a happy future." Elena looked at him carefully, studying the sincerity in his expression, the same quiet honesty she had noticed growing more familiar with each passing day. "Why does it feel like I trust you more after 5 days than I trusted Daniel after 2 years?" Perhaps because trust built on truth grows faster than trust built on lies, Vittorio said, even if the truth is difficult to hear. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the city lights glimmering faintly in the distance beyond the garden walls. Whatever battles remained ahead, tomorrow's meeting with Grace, the looming threat of a shareholder vote, the unresolved history between their families, Elena felt something steadying inside her that hadn't been present since the moment the church doors had opened. For the first time since her wedding collapsed into chaos, she felt less like a victim of circumstances beyond her control and more like someone preparing to fight for everything that mattered to her. Tomorrow, she would begin that fight in earnest. Inside the house, Peter remained awake long after Elena and Vittorio had retired for the evening, cross-referencing the names Daniel had provided against employment records and recent financial disclosures. By the time morning arrived, he had assembled a clearer picture of exactly how far Edward's influence had already spread within the company, information that would prove essential in the days ahead. At breakfast, Peter shared what he had found. Grace Bellamy isn't the only concern. There's a pattern here, subtle enough that it might have gone unnoticed for months if Daniel hadn't given us these names. Edward has been slowly building support among mid-level managers, people with enough access to influence shareholder sentiment, but not enough visibility that their sudden loyalty shifts would draw immediate attention. "How many people are we talking about?" Elena asked, her appetite disappearing as the scope of the problem became clearer. "At least 4, based on what I've found so far," Peter said. "Possibly more. Edward has been patient about this, which honestly concerns me more than if he had moved quickly and carelessly. Patient men are harder to catch before the damage is done." Vittorio studied the documents Peter had spread across the table, his expression thoughtful. If he's been building this quietly for months, he likely believed the wedding would simply be the final piece needed to secure everything without resistance. Elena walking away has forced him to accelerate a plan that was designed to unfold much more slowly and much more carefully. "Which means he might make mistakes now," Elena said, a flicker of hope emerging, despite the concerning news. "If he's rushing, he's more likely to expose himself." "Possibly," Peter agreed, "though desperate men can also become significantly more dangerous, not simply more careless. We should proceed as though both possibilities are equally likely." Elena nodded, feeling the weight of the coming days settle over her shoulders. Whatever ease she had briefly felt after the conversation with Daniel had already faded, replaced once again by the grim awareness that Edward Whitfield's reach extended further than she had initially understood. Grace Bellamy's office occupied the corner of the 3rd floor at Marlowe Textiles, a space Elena remembered visiting as a child, sneaking in to steal candy from the glass dish Grace always kept on her desk. Walking through those same doors now, flanked discreetly by 2 of Vittorio's men waiting in the lobby below, felt like stepping into an entirely different life. Grace looked up from her desk as Elena entered, surprise flickering across her face before settling into something more guarded. "Elena, I wasn't expecting you." "I think you know why I'm here," Elena said, closing the door behind her and taking a seat across from the desk without waiting for an invitation. Grace's hands stilled over her keyboard. "I heard about the wedding. I'm so sorry, dear. I can't imagine how difficult this week has been for you." "It's been difficult," Elena agreed, "especially learning that Edward Whitfield has been meeting privately with senior managers at my father's company, trying to convince them to support a hostile takeover." The color drained slowly from Grace's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Grace," Elena said gently, though firmly, "I've known you since I was 7 years old. You taught me how to read a balance sheet before I understood how to ride a bicycle without training wheels. Please don't insult either of us by pretending you don't know exactly what I'm talking about." Grace's composure crumbled slightly, her eyes dropping to the papers scattered across her desk. "He approached me 3 weeks ago," she admitted quietly. "He offered an enormous sum, more than I could earn here in 5 years combined. He said the company was struggling anyway, that his family would provide stability, that your father's leadership couldn't sustain much longer." "And you believed him?" "I didn't know what to believe," Grace said, her voice cracking with something close to shame. "My husband's medical bills have been overwhelming since his surgery last year. The offer felt like it might solve problems I've been drowning under for months. I know that doesn't excuse what I considered doing, but I wanted you to understand the position I was in. Elena softened slightly, recognizing the genuine desperation in Grace's voice, understanding that manipulation worked best when it exploited real vulnerabilities rather than manufacturing false ones. I'm not here to punish you, Grace. I'm here because I need you to understand what Edward Whitfield actually intends to do with this company, if his plan succeeds. She spent the next 20 minutes explaining everything she had learned: the original debt, Edward's long-term plan to marry into the company, and then dismantle it, the ultimate intention to eliminate her once the transfer was complete. Grace listened with growing horror, her earlier guilt transforming into something closer to fear as the full scope of Edward's ruthlessness became clear. I had no idea it went that far, Grace whispered when Elena finished. I thought this was simply an aggressive business acquisition, uncomfortable, but ultimately legal. I didn't realize he was planning something so much worse. Now you know, Elena said. The question is what you choose to do with that knowledge. Grace was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands folded on the desk. What do you need from me? I need you to help me expose exactly what he's been doing, Elena said. Not just to protect the company, but to protect everyone else he might be manipulating the same way he manipulated you. If we can prove Edward has been falsifying financial concerns to justify a takeover, his entire legal strategy collapses. Grace nodded slowly, resolve settling into her expression. I still have the documents he showed me, the numbers he wanted me to help present to the board as evidence of financial instability. They're deliberately misleading cherry-picked figures that ignore context entirely. I can gather everything for you. Grace hesitated, glancing toward the door as if checking that no one else could overhear. There's something else, Elena. Something I probably should have mentioned sooner, but I was too ashamed to say it plainly. What is it? Edward didn't only offer me money, Grace said, her voice dropping lower. He implied, quite clearly, that refusing his offer might create difficulties for my husband's ongoing medical treatment. He mentioned, almost casually, that he knew people on the hospital board, that funding for certain specialized programs could become uncertain if the wrong people lost confidence in the institution's leadership. I understood exactly what he meant, even though he never said it outright. Elena felt a cold anger settle into her chest, sharper than anything she had felt toward Daniel's betrayal. He threatened your husband's care to manipulate you. He never said it as a threat, Grace said carefully. He phrased it as a concern, a friendly observation about how connected the world of hospital funding can be. But I understood the message underneath the words. I was frightened, Elena. Frightened enough that I nearly agreed before I had time to think it through properly. You don't have to be afraid of him anymore, Elena said firmly, though she recognized even as she said it, that the promise might be more difficult to keep than she wanted to admit. Whatever happens with the company, I will make certain your husband's care isn't used as a weapon against you ever again. Grace's eyes filled with tears, relief and lingering fear mixing together in her expression. Thank you, Elena. I should have come to you the moment he first approached me. I'm sorry I let fear keep me quiet for as long as it did. Would you be willing to testify to what he offered you, if it comes to that? Elena asked carefully. I know that puts you at personal risk. Grace's jaw tightened with determination. Your father gave me my first real job when no one else would hire a woman with my background into a finance position. I owe him more loyalty than fear of Edward Whitfield deserves from me. Yes, I'll testify if necessary. Relief flooded through Elena, the first genuine victory she had felt since the wedding collapsed days earlier. Thank you, Grace. This means more than you know. As Elena prepared to leave, Grace called out one final piece of information. There's something else you should know. Edward isn't only targeting me. He's approached at least 2 other senior managers in the past month, offering similar arrangements. I don't know if they've accepted, but you should assume the shareholder vote threat is more serious than a single compromised employee. Elena's stomach tightened at this new complication, but she nodded resolutely. Then we need to move faster than we planned. Thank you again, Grace. I'll be in touch soon about next steps. She left the building with new evidence and a clearer picture of the battle ahead, meeting Nathan and the second security guard in the lobby before returning to the waiting car outside. The drive back to Vittorio's house felt different this time, less like fleeing danger and more like advancing toward a solution, however difficult that solution might prove to be. Vittorio met her in the study upon her return, listening carefully as she recounted everything Grace had shared. Peter joined them shortly after, taking notes rapidly as the picture of Edward's broader manipulation campaign became clearer. If he's approached multiple managers, Peter said, we need to identify them before the shareholder vote, not after. Confronting each one individually, offering them protection and honesty about Edward's true intentions, might be enough to unravel his entire strategy. That could take days we don't have, Vittorio observed. The vote could be called with as little as 2 weeks' notice, and we don't know how close Edward already is to that threshold. Elena thought for a long moment, an idea forming slowly in her mind. What if we don't wait for him to call the vote? What if we get ahead of it entirely, calling an emergency board meeting ourselves, presenting evidence of Edward's manipulation before he has the chance to finish building his case? Peter looked up from his notes, considering the suggestion carefully. As majority family shareholder, you do have the authority to call an emergency meeting. It would be unusual, but not against the company's bylaws. It would also force Edward to respond publicly and quickly, Vittorio added, warming to the strategy. If we control the timing, we control the narrative. Rather than defending against his accusations later, we present the evidence of his manipulation first, before he has a chance to solidify support among the managers he's approached. There's risk in moving this quickly, Peter cautioned. If we don't have enough concrete evidence yet, presenting an incomplete case could backfire badly. Edward would use any weakness in our presentation to paint you as desperate and reactive, rather than justified. Elena considered this carefully. Then we need more evidence before we call the meeting. Grace mentioned 2 other managers who may have been approached. We need to identify them and understand exactly what Edward offered each of them. I might be able to help with that, Vittorio said. My people have been monitoring Edward's movements since this began. If he's been meeting with company employees outside normal business hours, there's likely a pattern we can trace. Over the following 2 days, a careful investigation unfolded, Vittorio's security team cross-referencing Edward's known movements with employee schedules at Marlowe Textiles, while Grace quietly reached out to trusted colleagues she suspected might have been approached. By the end of the 2nd day, they had identified 2 additional managers, both of whom, once confronted privately with the full truth of Edward's intentions, agreed to cooperate rather than continue supporting his scheme. With mounting evidence and growing internal support, Elena called the emergency board meeting for the following week, timing it carefully to occur before Edward could finalize whatever legal claim he was still preparing regarding the original marriage agreement. The night before the meeting, Elena found herself unable to sleep, anxiety about the following day's confrontation keeping her awake despite the exhaustion weighing on every part of her body. She wandered downstairs eventually, finding Vittorio still awake in the study, reviewing documents by lamplight despite the late hour. You should be resting too, she said, settling into the chair across from him. I could say the same to you, Vittorio replied, setting aside the papers he had been reviewing. Nervous about tomorrow? Terrified, Elena admitted. I've never addressed the full board before, not like this. My father always handled these meetings. I've watched him do it 100 times, but watching and doing are very different things. You'll do well, Vittorio said, his confidence in her evident, despite the late hour clouding his own expression with fatigue. You've handled every difficult moment this week with more strength than most people would manage in a lifetime. Elena studied him carefully, something warm settling in her chest despite the anxiety still churning underneath. Can I ask you something? About the history between your family and the Whitfields. You said it was complicated, that it deserved more attention than we could give it in a hallway. We haven't had that conversation yet. Vittorio was quiet for a long moment, weighing whether to finally share what he had avoided discussing days earlier. Edward Whitfield and my father were partners once, many years before I was born fully into this world, a business venture that went badly, though the details of how badly depend on who tells the story. My father believed Edward stole from the partnership, funneling profits away before the venture officially collapsed. Edward believed my father pushed him out unfairly once the business began succeeding beyond their original expectations. Which version is true? Elena asked. Some combination of both, most likely, Vittorio admitted. My father was not always a fair man in business dealings, especially in his younger years. But Edward's dishonesty runs deeper than a single business dispute. Whatever happened between them originally, it planted a grudge that neither man ever released. When my father died, and I inherited the family's responsibilities, I inherited that grudge, along with everything else, whether I wanted it or not. Is that why you got involved in warning me? Elena asked carefully. Not just because of the promise you made my father, but because of your own history with Edward? Vittorio considered the question honestly before answering. Initially, perhaps that history influenced my willingness to investigate what Edward was planning. But Elena, the longer I've spent getting to know you these past days, the less this has felt like settling old grudges, and the more it has felt like something entirely separate. I don't want to see Edward defeated simply because of history between our families. I want to see you succeed because you deserve to succeed, regardless of any connection to my own past. Elena felt her breath catch slightly at the sincerity in his voice, at the vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. That's a significant thing to admit, she said softly. It is, Vittorio agreed, and I understand if it's too much, given everything else you're processing right now. You've just escaped one man's manipulation. The last thing you need is to feel pressured by another man's growing feelings. You're not pressuring me, Elena said, surprising herself with how quickly the words emerged. If anything, you've been more careful with my feelings this past week than Daniel ever was during 2 years of dating. That means something, Vittorio. It means more than I probably should admit, given how complicated everything already is. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of unspoken feelings settling gently between them, without demanding immediate resolution. Finally, Elena rose to return to her room, pausing at the doorway to look back at him. Thank you, she said, for everything, not just the protection, but the honesty. I don't think I fully understood how rare that combination was, until I experienced its absence for 2 years. The following morning arrived with brutal efficiency, Elena dressing carefully in a dark blue suit she had borrowed from Clara's niece, reviewing her presentation notes one final time as the car carried her toward the Marlowe Textiles headquarters. Vittorio accompanied her, along with Peter and Grace, who had insisted on standing beside Elena during the presentation, despite the personal risk involved in publicly opposing Edward Whitfield. The boardroom filled quickly, 12 board members taking their seats around the long table, along with several senior managers Elena recognized from her childhood visits to her father's office. Edward Whitfield arrived last, Daniel notably absent from his side, his expression carrying a confidence that suggested he had no idea what was about to unfold. Thank you all for attending this emergency session, Elena began, her voice steadier than she had expected given the anxiety churning beneath her composed exterior. I called this meeting because I have evidence of a serious threat to this company's stability, one that requires immediate attention from this board. Edward's expression shifted slightly, wariness creeping into his previously confident posture. Elena, I understand you've had a difficult week, but surely whatever concerns you have could wait for a properly scheduled meeting rather than this dramatic emergency session. I don't believe it can wait, Elena said firmly. Given that you've spent the past 2 months privately approaching senior managers at this company, offering them financial incentives to support false claims of financial instability, all in service of a hostile takeover you've been planning since long before my wedding was ever arranged. Gasps rippled around the table, board members exchanging startled glances, as Elena continued, laying out the evidence methodically. Grace stepped forward to confirm Edward's approach to her personally, describing the exact offer he had made and the misleading financial documents he had asked her to present as legitimate concerns. The 2 other managers who had been approached corroborated similar experiences, their testimony adding weight to the mounting case against Edward's manipulation. Edward's composure cracked slowly as the presentation continued, his careful denials growing increasingly strained as more evidence emerged, documents, dates, and testimony painting a clear picture of deliberate manipulation rather than legitimate business concern. This is outrageous, Edward finally said, rising from his chair, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. You have no proof any of this actually happened. These are simply accusations from disgruntled employees and a bitter young woman whose engagement fell apart due to her own fiancé's cold feet, not any wrongdoing on my family's part. I have signed statements from 3 separate managers, Elena said calmly, sliding copies across the table toward the assembled board members. I have documentation of the financial figures you asked them to present, figures that don't match this company's actual performance according to our audited records. And I have my father's own journal entries, dated years before this scheme began, documenting his concerns about your interest in me specifically, concerns he recorded long before Daniel and I ever met. The room fell silent as board members reviewed the documents Elena had provided, their expressions shifting from uncertainty to growing conviction as the weight of evidence became undeniable. Edward looked around the table, searching for allies among the board members, finding none willing to meet his gaze directly. "This meeting is over," Edward said finally, gathering his papers with shaking hands. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers." "I look forward to it," Elena said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her body. "Though I suspect once this board votes on the matter today, you'll find far less legal ground to stand on than you currently believe." Edward left the boardroom without another word, his footsteps echoing sharply down the hallway outside. The board members remained, turning their attention back to Elena with expressions that had shifted dramatically from the wary skepticism they had shown at the meeting's beginning. The vote that followed was nearly unanimous, the board formally rejecting any consideration of Edward Whitfield's claims regarding the marriage agreement, while simultaneously voting to strengthen protections against future manipulation attempts targeting company employees. Grace and the other managers who had testified were commended for their honesty, despite the personal risk involved, and Elena found herself, for the first time since the wedding collapsed, standing in a room where the truth had actually prevailed. Vittorio caught her eye from across the room as the meeting concluded, something like pride evident in his expression, despite his usual composed reserve. Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her, mixed with something else entirely, a growing awareness that the man who had interrupted her wedding only a week earlier had become something far more significant than the stranger who whispered 3 warning words at the altar. As the board members filed out and the room slowly emptied, Elena remained standing near the head of the table, looking out over the empty chairs where the fight for her father's legacy had just been won. The battle with Edward Whitfield was far from finished, but for the first time since this entire ordeal began, Elena felt something she hadn't expected to feel again so soon. She felt like she was finally winning. That night, a small celebration unfolded in Vittorio's study, Grace and Peter joining Elena and Vittorio for a quiet dinner to mark the victory, however incomplete it still felt, given the lawsuit still technically pending. Clara had prepared a simple but generous meal, insisting that a moment like this deserved more than the usual quiet dinners they had shared throughout the ordeal. "To Elena," Peter said, raising his glass once the meal had been served, who reminded an entire boardroom what integrity actually looks like. "To Grace," Elena countered, raising her own glass toward the older woman seated across from her, who found the courage to tell the truth even when it meant risking everything. Grace flushed slightly, though pleased pride was evident beneath her modest protest. "I only did what your father would have wanted, dear. He gave me a chance when few others would have. Standing up for his daughter felt like the smallest way I could repay that kindness." The conversation drifted easily through the evening, lighter than any of them had allowed themselves to feel in weeks, though Elena noticed Vittorio remained quieter than usual, watching her across the table with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. When the others eventually retired for the evening, Elena lingered in the study, drawn back to the fire that had become a familiar companion throughout this entire ordeal. "You did something remarkable today," Vittorio said, joining her near the hearth. "I've watched grown executives crumble under far less pressure than what you faced in that boardroom." "I had a lot of help," Elena said. "Grace, Peter, you. I couldn't have done any of it alone." "Perhaps not," Vittorio agreed. "But the courage to stand up and speak the truth in front of people who could destroy your future with a single vote, that came from you, Elena. No one else could have carried that moment for you." Elena studied him carefully, noticing again the way his composed exterior seemed to soften whenever they were alone together, the careful reserve giving way to something warmer, more genuine. "Why does it feel like you're proud of me?" she asked softly. "Because I am," Vittorio said simply, without hesitation. "More than I probably should admit, given how complicated everything still is." The fire crackled between them, and for a long moment, neither spoke. The quiet, comfortable, rather than tense. Elena found herself wondering, not for the first time, what exactly was growing between them beneath the surface of protection and strategy that had defined their relationship so far. "The lawsuit is still pending," she said eventually, breaking the silence. "Edward hasn't given up yet." "No," Vittorio agreed. "But tonight, I think we're allowed to celebrate what you've already accomplished, regardless of what still lies ahead." Elena smiled, some of the tension of the past weeks finally easing from her shoulders. "Then let's celebrate," she said, and for the rest of that evening, the looming threat of Edward Whitfield felt, for the first time in weeks, like something they could actually overcome. The victory at the boardroom table did not end things as cleanly as Elena had hoped. 2 days after the vote, Peter arrived at Vittorio's house with news that stole the brief sense of peace they had all begun to enjoy. "Edward's lawyers filed the lawsuit this morning," Peter said, spreading documents across the study table. "Exactly what we expected, claiming the original loan agreement entitles him to a controlling share of the company regardless of the marriage's failure to complete. It's weak legally, but weak claims can still cause damage if he's determined enough to drag this through the courts for months." Elena felt her stomach tighten. Months of uncertainty, months of the company's reputation being dragged through public speculation. "That's likely his intention," Vittorio said grimly. "He knows he can't win outright anymore, not after the board meeting exposed his manipulation so thoroughly. But he can still cause damage, still make you bleed resources and stability, even in defeat." Grace, who had begun attending strategy sessions regularly since the board meeting, spoke up from her seat near the window. "There's something else you should both know. I heard from a contact still working closely with Edward's office. He's been drinking heavily since the vote, becoming erratic with his own staff. 2 of his senior employees resigned yesterday, citing concerns about his judgment. A man losing control rarely becomes less dangerous," Vittorio observed. "Often the opposite." That evening, as Elena reviewed the lawsuit documents alone in the study, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering, curiosity eventually winning over caution. "Elena," Daniel's voice, quiet and strained, filled the line. "I need to warn you about something." "I'm listening," Elena said carefully, gesturing for Nathan, who had been posted nearby, to alert Vittorio. "My father isn't handling the lawsuit as his only plan," Daniel said, his words coming quickly, urgently. "He's furious, Elena. More furious than I've ever seen him. He mentioned something tonight about making sure you regret humiliating him publicly. I don't know exactly what he means, but I've never heard him talk like this before. I think he's planning something dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Elena asked, her pulse quickening. "I don't know specifics," Daniel admitted, "but he had 2 men in his study tonight I've never seen before. Men who don't work in any official capacity for the company. Please, Elena, be careful. Whatever protection you have, don't let your guard down, not even for a moment." The call ended abruptly, and Elena sat frozen for a moment, processing the warning before rushing to find Vittorio, who had already begun assembling additional security based on Nathan's alert. "We need to increase protection immediately," Vittorio said once Elena had relayed the full conversation. "If Edward has brought in outside men, this isn't about intimidation through legal channels anymore. This is something else entirely." Elena sat down slowly, the reality of the warning settling over her like a physical weight. "I thought we had already won. The board meeting, the evidence against him, all of it should have been enough to stop this. Winning in a boardroom and accepting defeat gracefully are 2 very different things," Vittorio said gently. "Men like Edward do not simply walk away when their plans fail publicly. Public failure often makes them more dangerous, not less, because they feel they have nothing left to lose." "What do we do?" Elena asked, fear creeping back into her voice despite the weeks of growing confidence she had built since the wedding collapsed. "We prepare," Vittorio said firmly. "I'll contact every member of the security team tonight. We'll assume the worst and plan accordingly, and we'll make certain that whatever Edward attempts, he finds far more resistance than he anticipates." Grace, who had been staying in a guest room since the board meeting for her own safety, appeared in the doorway, her expression tight with worry. "I heard raised voices. Is everything all right?" Daniel called with a warning, Elena said. Edward may be planning something more direct than a lawsuit. Grace's face paled. I should have expected this. Men who threaten a woman's dying husband to secure her silence are not men who respect boundaries of any kind. None of us could have predicted exactly how far he would go, Vittorio said. But we can prepare for it now. Grace, I want you to stay close to the house until this settles. I'll have additional security assigned to you as well, given your role in exposing his manipulation. Grace nodded, gratitude and fear mixing in her expression. Thank you. I only wish I had come forward sooner, before it came to this. You came forward exactly when it mattered most, Elena said firmly. None of us can change the timeline now. We can only decide how carefully we move forward from here. Over the following 2 days, security around Vittorio's estate tightened considerably. Additional guards posted at every entrance. Patrol patterns increased throughout the grounds. Elena found the constant vigilance exhausting, a reminder that despite the victory in the boardroom, the danger surrounding her had not actually diminished, only shifted into a more uncertain shape. The attack, when it came, arrived without warning on the 3rd night. Elena had gone to bed early, exhausted from days of tension, when the sound of shattering glass somewhere on the ground floor jolted her upright. Alarms began blaring throughout the house almost immediately, security lights flooding the grounds outside her window with harsh white illumination. Nathan burst into her room without knocking, his expression tight with urgency. We have intruders on the east side of the property. Vittorio wants you moved to the safe room immediately. Elena's heart pounded as she followed Nathan through hallways suddenly filled with movement, security personnel calling coordinates to one another, the sound of running footsteps echoing throughout the house. They reached a reinforced room, hidden behind what appeared to be an ordinary study wall, Nathan ushering her inside, before securing the heavy door behind them. Stay here, Nathan instructed. No matter what you hear, do not leave this room until someone confirms it's safe. The minutes that followed felt endless, muffled sounds of commotion reaching Elena through the reinforced walls, though nothing distinct enough to understand what was actually happening outside. She paced the small room anxiously, her mind racing through worst possibilities, terrified for Vittorio's safety, despite his obvious experience handling exactly this kind of danger. After what felt like an eternity but was likely closer to 20 minutes, the heavy door finally opened again, revealing Vittorio himself, a small cut visible above his eyebrow, but otherwise appearing unharmed. It's over, he said, relief evident beneath his composed exterior. 3 men attempted to breach the property. We managed to intercept them before they reached the main house. Are they Edward's men? Elena asked, rushing forward despite herself, relief flooding through her at seeing him safe. One of them confirmed it before local authorities arrived, Vittorio said. Edward hired outside contractors, men with no direct connection to his legitimate business, specifically to make it harder to trace the attack back to him. Fortunately, my security team anticipated exactly this kind of move given Daniel's warning. What happens now? Elena asked, still processing the reality that Edward's desperation had escalated to attempted violence. Now, Vittorio said, Edward Whitfield has made a mistake severe enough that even his remaining allies won't be able to protect him. Attempted breaking and entering with hired men caught on our security cameras, combined with everything already exposed at the board meeting, gives authorities more than enough to pursue serious charges. The following morning brought confirmation of exactly that outcome. News spread quickly through business circles that Edward Whitfield had been arrested, the men caught during the previous night's failed intrusion providing statements that implicated him directly in orchestrating the attack. Combined with mounting evidence of his manipulation attempts against Marlowe Textiles employees, the legal case against him collapsed his remaining credibility entirely within days. Daniel, distancing himself completely from his father's actions, issued a public statement acknowledging his own role in the original deception, expressing genuine remorse for his part in a plan that had ultimately endangered someone he claimed to have genuinely cared for. Whatever remained of the Whitfield family's business reputation crumbled rapidly in the weeks that followed, investors withdrawing support, business partnerships dissolving as the full scope of Edward's schemes became public knowledge. For Elena, the resolution felt strangely quiet after weeks of relentless danger and uncertainty. She returned to Marlowe Textiles fully, stepping into a more active leadership role, alongside the board members, who had supported her through the crisis. Grace remained by her side, as a trusted advisor, their relationship strengthened, rather than damaged, by the honesty that had ultimately defined their partnership through the ordeal. 3 weeks after Edward's arrest, Elena found herself once again in Vittorio's study, though the tension that had once filled the room had softened considerably into something calmer, more settled. "The company is stable again," Elena said, reviewing quarterly reports that showed steady recovery from the uncertainty of recent months. "Better than stable, actually. Several new investors have reached out, impressed by how the board handled the crisis." "Your father would be proud," Vittorio said, watching her from across the room with an expression that had grown increasingly difficult for either of them to hide. "I think he would be," Elena agreed, setting the reports aside. "Though I suspect he'd have complicated feelings about exactly how his company survived this particular crisis." "Complicated how?" Vittorio asked, though something in his tone suggested he already understood what she meant. Elena rose from her chair, crossing the room to stand closer to him, gathering courage she hadn't quite possessed during their earlier conversations. "My father asked you to protect me, all those years ago, without ever imagining what that protection would eventually require. I don't think he anticipated his daughter falling in love with the man he asked to keep her safe." Vittorio's composed expression finally broke fully, something warm and unguarded, replacing the careful reserve he had maintained, even through their closest moments, over the past several weeks. "Is that what's happening here, Elena? Are you telling me you've fallen in love with me?" "I think I have been for weeks," Elena admitted, "somewhere between you whispering 3 words at my wedding and standing beside me through everything that followed. I stopped seeing you as simply the man protecting me from danger, and started seeing you as someone I wanted beside me, regardless of whether danger existed at all." Vittorio closed the remaining distance between them, reaching up to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch far more tender than his composed reputation would have suggested possible. "I've felt the same way since the moment you refused to simply accept Daniel's excuses at the altar, since you insisted on knowing every difficult truth rather than retreating into comfortable ignorance. You've shown more strength these past weeks than most people demonstrate in a lifetime, Elena. I fell in love with that strength before I fully understood what I was feeling." "What happens now?" Elena asked softly, echoing the same question she had asked him weeks earlier, in an entirely different context. "Now," Vittorio said, his voice gentle but certain, "I would like the chance to court you properly. Not through arrangements made by our families, not through obligations tied to old debts or promises made to your father, simply because I want to know you, fully, without the shadow of danger hanging over every conversation we share." Elena smiled, the first genuinely light expression she had felt in weeks. "I would like that very much." Their relationship developed slowly over the following months, built on the foundation of honesty that had defined their connection from the earliest days of crisis. Elena continued rebuilding Marlowe Textiles alongside Grace and the loyal board members who had supported her, the company growing stronger with each passing quarter, as its reputation for integrity spread throughout the business community. Vittorio remained a constant presence throughout, though never in a way that overshadowed Elena's own growing confidence as a leader in her own right. He attended board meetings when invited, offered advice when asked, but consistently deferred to her judgment on matters concerning the company her father had built, understanding intuitively that her healing required agency, not rescue. 1 year after the wedding that never was, Elena stood once again in a church, though this time the circumstances could not have been more different. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, illuminating white roses mixed with blue hydrangeas, the same flowers she had chosen for her first wedding, though this time selected with genuine joy rather than obligation. Vittorio waited at the altar, his expression holding none of the composed reserve that had characterized their first meeting, replaced instead by open, unguarded happiness as Elena walked toward him. Her mother sat in the front row, tears streaming freely down her face, though this time from pure joy rather than the guilty anguish that had marked the previous ceremony. As Elena reached the altar, Vittorio leaned close, his voice carrying only to her, echoing the moment that had changed everything between them so many months earlier. 3 words, he said softly, smiling. I love you. Elena felt tears gathering in her own eyes, the weight of everything they had survived together, settling into something beautiful rather than traumatic. I love you too, she whispered back. The ceremony proceeded without interruption this time. No dramatic entrance, no whispered warnings, no hidden schemes waiting to unravel everything she believed about her future. Just two people who had found genuine trust through the fire of crisis, choosing each other freely, without obligation or manipulation shadowing their promises. When the priest finally pronounced them married, the church erupted not into chaos, but into genuine celebration, guests rising to their feet with applause and joy, rather than shocked whispers. Elena looked out at the faces gathered to witness this moment. Her mother, Grace, Peter, Nathan, Clara, and so many others who had stood beside her through the darkest weeks of her life, now gathered to celebrate the light that had finally emerged from that darkness. Vittorio took her hand as they walked back down the aisle together, husband and wife, no longer strangers, brought together by old debts and dangerous schemes, but partners who had chosen each other through honesty, courage, and genuine love. Outside the church, autumn sunlight bathed the courtyard in warm golden light, guests gathering to shower them with well wishes as they stepped into their future together. Elena paused for a moment, looking back at the church doors, remembering the chaos that had once poured through them, the fear and betrayal that had once defined this exact location in her memory. Now, those doors represented something entirely different, not an ending forced upon her by other people's schemes, but a beginning she had chosen for herself, built on truth rather than deception, on genuine love rather than manufactured obligation. She turned back to Vittorio, squeezing his hand gently as they walked together toward the waiting car, toward a future neither of them could have imagined on that chaotic day when 3 whispered words had changed everything. Whatever challenges still waited ahead, Elena faced them now, not as someone hiding from danger, but as someone who had learned, through the hardest possible circumstances, exactly what she was capable of surviving, and exactly what kind of love was worth building a life around. The wedding that finally mattered had nothing to do with debts or company shares or old family grudges. It had everything to do with 2 people who had found, in the middle of chaos and danger, something real enough to build an entire future upon. The reception that followed unfolded in the same gardens where Elena had once walked anxiously with her mother in the earliest days of the crisis, though now the same paths were lined with string lights and long tables set with white linen, laughter replacing the tense whispers that had once filled these grounds. Elena moved through the crowd of guests with Vittorio's hand steady in hers, greeting employees from Marlowe Textiles who had stood by her through the uncertainty, old family friends who had worried quietly through the scandal, and new faces who had become close companions through the months of rebuilding that followed. Grace approached them near the edge of the garden, her husband beside her, healthier now than he had been during the worst of the crisis. The medical treatments that had once been used as leverage against her, now simply a part of their ordinary life again. I never imagined, standing in my office that day, terrified of what Edward Whitfield might do, that it would end here, Grace said, embracing Elena warmly. Your father would be so proud of the woman you've become. I couldn't have become her without you, Elena said sincerely. Your courage that day changed everything. Later, as the evening wound down and guests began drifting toward their cars, Elena found a quiet moment alone with Vittorio, near the edge of the garden, away from the music and conversation, the stars beginning to appear overhead in the darkening sky. Any regrets? Vittorio asked, only half joking, his arms settling comfortably around her shoulders. Only that it took a disaster of a wedding to find my way here, Elena said, leaning into him. Though I suppose some paths only reveal themselves after everything else falls apart first. Your father used to say something similar, Vittorio said quietly, that the hardest seasons often plant the seeds for whatever grows strongest afterward. I didn't understand it fully until I watched you rebuild everything he left behind, piece by piece, out of the wreckage of a wedding neither of us could have predicted. Elena looked up at him, memorizing this moment the way she had once memorized the vows she never got to speak to another man. I'm glad you whispered those 3 words in that church, she said softly, even though it destroyed everything I thought my life was supposed to look like. So am I, Vittorio said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. because it gave us the chance to build something real instead. They stood together beneath the stars for a while longer, the sounds of the departing celebration fading gently behind them, two people who had found, through danger and betrayal and the slow rebuilding of trust, exactly the kind of love worth spending a lifetime protecting. And as they finally turned to walk back toward the house together, leaving behind every shadow of the past, Elena understood, more fully than she ever had before, that sometimes the worst day of your life is only the beginning of finding the best one.